This is the first part of a 10-part series on the history of a New England mill city. In this episode, we're kicking off our story 500 years ago, encapsulating first contact of the Abenaki people with the European colonists. This series is inspired by YouTuber Do Not Eat's Franklin series and Dan Carlin's Hardcore History podcast. Welcome to Dawson. I come from a small city in Maine called Lewiston. If you were to drive off the interstate exit through the suburbs into downtown and stop at the corner of Pine and Lisbon streets, you would see City Hall, the library, a colorful mural, trees lining the wide sidewalks, and just down Pine Street, you would see a tower made of brick. Under it are 4 stories of shiny new glass windows. If you walk even closer and stop over the canal, this building stretches for 2 long blocks, towering over you like a fortress. Let's say we had the power to turn back time 500 years. No more brick buildings, no more canals. All it is a forest. Most of these buildings have only been here for 100 years, maybe a couple hundred in some places. You put that into perspective of cities in Europe, which some have been there since medieval times. That's what? 1,000 years? Maybe? The thing about cities is that they are not just buildings and murals and streets, it's the people that live there. The history that brought it to where it is, and the tiny, minuscule decisions of some of those people that ended up entirely changing other people's lives down the road. There's a story behind these places. It is themes that are still so relevant to this day. Lewiston is just like many other cities in New England. I call mill cities. Think of Lowell, Lawrence, and many, many others in Massachusetts, or Manchester in New Hampshire, Woonsocket in Rhode Island, and Waterville, Biddeford, and Brunswick in Maine. These all share astoundingly similar stories. If there was only a way to capture the feelings, the struggles, the lives of all these people, maybe there is. Maybe, as long as it's a fictional place and a fictional story, these lives can be captured and their stories retold. Before there was any city of regional importance in the United States and Canada, there was likely a First Nations tribe living around there. In this area where, in 5 centuries, will be the modern-day city of Dawson, and what we would now consider Western Maine, we find a village of the Abenaki nation called the Amesek. I'm certainly no expert in Native American studies. I'm not going to pretend to be. I'm an electrical engineering student, so all of the information and history and I present on here is based on sources which I have found, and I will cite for each episode in the video description. I'm treating this narration through the series as a sort of essay with sources, but something more casual and conversational. If you don't like essays, sorry. Hopefully the conversational aspect will make it a bit more interesting, and if you don't like the casual conversation part, sorry again. This series has no intention of being used as a source for your midterm paper. I like the way Dan Carlin puts it. He says that he considers himself a fan of history, not a historian. I relate to that phrase, and even so, I'm a student of history here at my university, and I don't expect every viewer to be happy with the history I present, but That's the thing. It's history. And we have to look at the ugly things right in the face, because if we don't recognize that, then we are bound to repeat it. What's disappointing with this episode is that most, if not all, sources about the First Nations are that they're from either modern day or Europeans. There are rarely primary sources in this era, so in a way, we're a bit removed from this history because we don't have those first-hand accounts. I found a document written by an Abenaki elder in 1955 named Stephen Laurent. He talks about all the different nations and the tribes in the area. I'd like to apologize in advance for any mispronunciation of nation names. Quote, "The Abenakis were a subdivision of the Algonquin nation. According to the ethnologists, there were two great native confederacies at the time of Cartier and Champlain, the Algonquins and the Iroquois. The Algonquins stretched from Newfoundland to the Rockies and from Hudson's Bay to the Carolinas. Like an island in the midst of these Algonquins were the Iroquois, or Five Nations, with New York State as their main habitat. Generally speaking, these Algonquins were divided as follows. The Northern Division, north of the St. Lawrence and the Great Lakes. The Northeastern Division, comprising of the Maritimes, Eastern Quebec and Maine, New Hampshire and Vermont. The Central Division in the Midwestern states, and the Western Division as far as the Rocky Mountains. The Abenakis belonged to the Northeastern Division. The Abenaki Indians were only one of many New England tribes and were themselves further subdivided into smaller groups like the Sokaki, the Penobscots, the Cusacks, the Missisquoi, and others, according to the names of the regions, rivers, or lakes near which they lived. The difficulty that specialists today, 1955, have in making strict tribal distinctions is due to the fact that these names are geographical rather than racial. Once an anthropologist from the University of Pennsylvania, Dr. Speck, said to my father, "Well, Chief Laurent, I have studied your language and culture from an ethnic standpoint, and my conclusion is that you belong to that group of Abenaki Indians known as the Kennebecanoaks." A few years later, he came back to visit my father and said, "I'll have to take that back, about your being a Kennebecanoak. Further research leads me to believe that you belong rather to the Penobscot subtribe." My father smiled and said, "Well, Dr. Speck, I hope that I'll live long enough to find out just before I die what kind of Indian I am." End quote. Where we're finding ourselves, we have the fictional Abenaki tribe of the Amesek, who get their food from the river, which has an abundance of salmon, bass, and trout. Hunting is also a major part of life for the Amesek. European contact with the First Nations has been traced as early back as the 16th century. In April of 1534, under a commission from King Francis I of France, Jacques Cartier set sail from France to try and discover a western passage to the rich ports of Asia. After 20 days, Cartier did not find Asia, but instead he ended up on the coast of what is now Newfoundland. After sailing around the northern tip of Newfoundland, he sailed around the Gulf of St. Lawrence, and at Chaleur Bay, he ended up trading with the First Nation of the Micmac twice. After this, he ended up in the Gaspé region, and on July 24th, planted a cross and declared the land for the King of France. From this, the St. Lawrence Iroquois realized what kind of business Cartier was really there for. And after Cartier committed some kidnapping, a solution was confirmed where Cartier would keep the two hostages in return that Cartier came back with European goods. Cartier then came back to St. Lawrence River twice, and in 1608, Samuel de Champlain settled and founded the colony of Quebec. In the earliest part of the century, rumors circulated around in Europe of a brilliantly wealthy city inhabited by the native population called Norumbega. A sailor named David Ingren is said to have walked over 3,000 miles from Mexico to Nova Scotia, and his chronicles of what he believed he saw were recorded. Quote, "He saw kings decorated with rubies 6 inches long, and they were borne on chairs of silver and crystal, adorned with precious stones. He saw pearls as common as pebbles, and the natives were laden down by their ornaments of gold and silver. The city of Bega was 3/4 of a mile long and had many streets wider than those of London. Some houses had massive pillars of crystal and silver." End quote. Really, this sounds like a northern version of El Dorado, but roughly where Bangor, Maine is today. And it certainly sounds like his head was in the clouds. But it didn't even matter if this was true or not, because this mythical city got into the minds of many European people in the last few decades of the 16th century. And when Samuel de Champlain set sail to go to North America, one of the things on his to-do list was to find Norumbega. I find it so fascinating how a rumor like this can get started and will just influence a society so much that it ends up altering what the world could become. Even with the first contact in North America with the Vikings in the 11th century, nothing of great importance for us in the modern era came of that, until the 16th and 17th century with explorations by France, Spain, and England. There are two reasons, well, I'm sure there are more, but there are two reasons why a country will get quickly mobilized. Whether it's a war, colonization, or exploration. It's either for defense or capital gain. The capital gain possibilities of Norumbega and El Dorado were enough to mobilize these European powers, and it changed everything. In 1607, only a year before the foundation of Quebec, the colony of Popham at the mouth of the Kennebec River in Maine was established as a competitor to the also new Jamestown in Virginia. But this colony was short-lived. During the same century, a collection of English colonies were consolidated to form the province of Maine. So, the 17th century was a big time for land grabbing by the French and English in Acadia, the Maritimes, and New England. Trade with the Abenaki involved fur in return for metal axes, guns, and metal cookware. And because of the permanent settlement of Quebec in 1608, fur trade went from seasonal to year-round. Around this time, the Micmac, Maliseet, Passamaquoddy, Abenaki, and Penobscot nations formed the Wabanaki Confederacy, with the purpose of protecting each other as the Iroquois nation increased raids on these other nations. The website of the Pleasant Point Tribal Government, a Passamaquoddy nation, explains this in detail. Quote, "By the early 1680s, the English had crushed an Algonquin uprising in southern New England, which became known as King Philip's War. This uprising, which primarily involved the Wampanoag, Nipmuc, and Narragansett, had greatly alarmed their northern neighbors, in particular the Abenaki inhabiting the valleys of the Saco, Androscoggin, and Kennebec. Overpowered by the English, hundreds of, and I'm paraphrasing, Indian survivors fled to southern New England and crossed the Piscataqua River to settle among the Abenaki of Maine, while others retreated to French mission villages in the St. Lawrence Valley. Although fighting had stopped in southern New England during the summer of 1676, English settlers and local Abenakis skirmished on the Maine coast, and a few other incidents occurred further down east. Uneasy peace returned to New England's frontiers with Indian country when treaties formally ended the fighting in 1678. The decade following this first Anglo-Wabanaki War became a political watershed for several reasons. As a quickly rising power, New England showed a growing appetite for the rich fisheries on the northern Atlantic coasts and began to threaten French interests in the region. Meanwhile, competing for control over the fur trade in the interior and trying to expand their influence to Western tribal nations, the French in Canada continued their bitter feuding with their Iroquois neighbors. Given this volatile situation, the thinly populated, poorly defended, and disorganized French colonies in Canada and Acadia formed easy targets for enemy attacks. The French crown feared that it could lose all its possessions in the region and instructed its colonial officials to create a protective buffer of allied tribal villages in the borderlands. Jesuits and other Catholic missionaries familiar with the Aboriginal communities and often knowing the regional languages were instrumental in carrying out this French Indian policy. The Abenaki and their neighbors saw the same dark clouds swelling on the horizon. Recalling the slaughter that had killed thousands of their unfortunate neighbors in southern New England, they were well aware that the few survivors had lost nearly all their tribal lands. Urged by fear, they understood that there was no place for remembering old wrongs, and that the time had come to forge a lasting friendship. Tribal delegations were sent to each other's villages to discuss war and peace. In the wake of this diplomatic initiative, they created the alliance that has become known as the Wabanaki Confederacy. End quote. King Philip's War is said to be, per capita, the bloodiest war in U.S. history. The bloodiest. The Wabanaki Confederacy reminds me of David versus Goliath. On one hand, you have a civilization who's definitely less technologically advanced, and on the other, you have these extremely powerful French and English kingdoms. Naturally, I love an underdog story, and I always root for the underdog. I've noticed it's a common theme in history. What it really reminds me of is about a collection of tribes way back in history that fought against the Romans. I believe it was the Germanic tribes. The Roman army fought bloody battles against these tribes for around 600 years and eventually became one of the reasons why the Roman Empire fell. I genuinely admire the Wabanaki response to the invasion onto their lands. And if you didn't tell me how this ended up, I would have at least hoped that the Wabanaki Confederacy won. Sometimes I wonder what it would have been like if they won and drove out the Europeans. We know that our world is different. At the end of King Philip's War, the Native American population of southern New England was decimated. In Maine, the Wabanaki Confederacy's repeated campaigns against the colonists east of the Saco River claimed them victory, and signed the first Treaty of Casco Bay with the English colonists. This treaty had the Abenaki recognize the property rights of the English colonists while maintaining Abenaki sovereignty over the land, with the condition that the colonists would pay an annual tax of a peck of corn to the Wabanaki and government control of the fur trade. Despite the recent memories of the Wabanaki campaigns, the settlers and traders refused to abide by the treaty. Traders would continue to perform unfair practices against the Wabanaki, and settlers placed nets across the Saco River to prevent fish from migrating upriver to Wabanaki villages. Tensions were still tight between the First Nations and the European colonists in northern New England and the Maritimes. and remained so until the end of Father Lelouch's war in 1755. The French aligned with the Wabanaki Confederacy, fighting against the British. This war ended with British victory, with decimation of the Micmac Nation, and the mass deportation of Acadians in the Maritimes. With their settlements burned, Acadian families were separated and then exiled to southern Louisiana, the St. John River Valley, down the East Coast, and even France and Britain, many of whom did not survive that journey. Today, all that remains of the Abenaki people is one tribe in Vermont. The rest have either resettled in Quebec or have been killed off from war or eugenics. Even today in 2020, Abenaki people have yet to gain recognition in New Hampshire. The story of the First Nations of New England lasted thousands of years, and then in only 100 years was destroyed. Today in Maine, small tribes of the Penobscot, Maliseet, and Micmac still exist, and even after nearly 500 years, are still fighting for their land. The story of the First Nations around the world contains some of the most horrific treatment by colonizers, both directly and indirectly. Most First Nations cultures were either completely or partially destroyed, with only a little bit of the population still left. Imagine having your culture wiped out, your friends and family murdered, and then you left alone to die on the street of some alien place. I can't even imagine what it would be like for me if I were in their shoes. I don't even know what it would look like for us. It's incredibly difficult to comprehend that. So imagine what it was like for them. Thank you for watching or listening to this first episode. If you like this, please consider subscribing so you get the next episode as soon as it drops, whenever that may be. If you would like to get in touch with me directly, you can email me at unnamednarrative@gmail.com, and you can follow me on Instagram and Twitter at the handle unnamedwithmatt.